Hello, human geographers. We are back tonight for our next lecture in the political geography chapter. And tonight is the first part of a two-part series of lectures on boundaries. Split these two up, hopefully make them a little bit easier to sit through because they could be kind of long as one. So here we go. Boundaries. Let's start out with a definition. An invisible line that marks the extent of a state's territory. And the question I always start out with when we're talking about boundaries is, can you see most boundaries from space? If we were up in space looking down, would we be able to see the boundaries that separate different states? And the answer is generally no, because boundaries, generally speaking, are a human construct, something that we create, something that we learn and we accept, and occasionally we challenge. All right, but boundaries are a manifestation of territoriality, so it's a good idea to review the definition of territoriality. So from our last talk, we said that territoriality is an individual or group attempt to identify and establish control over a defined territory considered partially or wholly an exclusive domain, the behavior associated with the defense of the home territory. Again, when it comes to boundaries, we're talking about defining a territory and establishing control over it. All right, once you have defined it, you can establish control over it. So let's take a look at how boundaries are defined. So every boundary must be defined and delimited, and some boundaries can be demarcated as well. So let's take a look at this. All definitions, but you're going to want to shorten these down and come up with a way to remember them because they're very, very similar, at least in appearance, but they fundamentally mean different things. Definition. In political geography, the written legal description in a treaty-like document of a boundary between two countries. Essentially, when a boundary is defined, it's where it's agreed upon. All right, where two parties, two countries, two territories say, all right, this is the dividing line. That's defined. Delimited means, in political geography, the translation of the written terms of a boundary treaty, the definition, into an official cartographic representation, where it's going to be drawn. All right, so a delimited boundary is where it's drawn. Finally, you have to have, or you may have, demarcation. In political geography, the actual placing of a political boundary on the landscape by means of barriers, fences, walls, or other markers. Demarcated is where a boundary is seen, where we can see the boundary because it's got a wall or a fence or something. All right? And so that's something where you don't necessarily have to have that because there's plenty of boundaries throughout the world that aren't demarcated. But there's plenty of examples of where they are. So we're going to take a look at some of the demarcated boundaries that have existed throughout history and some still exist to this day. Obviously, the Great Wall of China, a historical example from the 4th century BCE. Hadrian's Wall throughout northern England, what is now the United Kingdom. The 8 Mile Wall in Detroit, separating white and black parts of Detroit. The Berlin Wall, perhaps one of the most famous walls of the 20th century, separating East and West Berlin. We mentioned this in a previous lecture when we talked about the Cold War, because remember the Soviet Union constructed the Berlin Wall to separate East and West Berlin. The Israeli West Bank Wall, and then the U.S.-Mexico border wall. There is a border wall between the United States and Mexico and has been since at least the mid-1990s when President Clinton was in office. And there was kind of a ramping up of control of the U.S.-Mexico border. But to be clear, it's not completely contiguous. It's not all one piece. It's kind of hit and miss. A lot more urbanized with respect to that. So there's a border fence, but there's also a car fence as well. And both of these examples come from Arizona. But to be clear, there's examples throughout Texas and other parts of the United States along the U.S.-Mexico border. And we're going to take a look at that a little bit more clearly in class. So this lecture is really looking at the different types of boundaries that exist. We'll provide some examples. Next lecture, the second half of this lecture, part 2, is going to look at kind of the impact of boundaries. This is going to be a lot more in-depth in the next lecture. All right. So we start out with the different types of boundaries. So a lot of definitions here. Again, underlining is important. Underlining key vocabulary terms is important, but make sure that you provide examples, ask questions, make sure that you point out, rewrite the definition, or point out a really key word that you want to remember as an association, things like that. So we start out with an antecedent boundary. An antecedent boundary, as the prefix kind of suggests, it means before. Ante means before. A boundary line established before the area in question is well populated. A great example of this is the western boundary of the U.S.-Canada border, which was established by treaty between the United States and Great Britain in 1846. And in fact, most of Canada's internal boundaries are antecedent boundaries. Most of the internal boundaries, subnational unit boundaries, were established before those areas were well populated. Right? There were some people, but not a lot. Right? Subsequent boundaries, again, as the name kind of suggests, it came after. A boundary line that is established after the area in question has been settled and that reflects the cultural characteristics of the bounded area. So we're going to take a look at 2 types of subsequent boundaries moving forward. And those 2 are consequent and superimposed. A consequent boundary is a boundary line that coincides with some cultural divide, such as religion or language, and is also known as an ethnographic boundary. So if you see ethnographic, be aware it means the same as consequent. And it's the consequent of, or consequence of, some kind of cultural divide, which is why you might see ethnographic. A great example of a subsequent boundary is the boundary between Northern Ireland, which is part of the United Kingdom, and the Republic of Ireland. The North is largely Protestant, where the South, or what is the Republic of Ireland, is predominantly Catholic. So the boundary between those 2 is a consequent boundary reflecting the religious differences between the 2. And then finally, a superimposed boundary is a boundary line placed over and ignoring an existing cultural pattern. And the best example that we're going to look at is of Africa during the colonial period. And Europeans came in, drew their own lines without regard for language, ethnicity, things like that. So they came in and superimposed. They put on top of boundaries that already existed. And so we're going to take a look at that. So again, this is looking at let's go ahead and ask, what type of map are we looking at? And we're looking at a choropleth map here. And so this is looking at the percentage of Ireland, the island of Ireland, that is Roman Catholic. And the darker shade of blue is more Roman Catholic, and the darker the shade of red is less Roman Catholic. And so when you're looking at that, where would you draw the line between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland? Because here's where they drew the line. So can you see the consequent boundary that was drawn here? They looked at, okay, where is the population predominantly Roman Catholic, and the part that is less Roman Catholic remained as part of the United Kingdom, and still to this day remains part of the United Kingdom. And so a great example of a consequent boundary. Maps in Africa. In this case, looking at languages in Africa, so a lot of language diversity in Africa, different languages, different language families, as well as ethnicities. A lot of ethnic diversity in Africa. Now, these two maps don't even take into account the fact that there were political boundaries that had existed between different tribal groups. These weren't, boundaries that were necessarily demarcated that Europeans could see when they came in, but were they defined between different tribal groups? Did they know where they were? Well, sure. And perhaps because they were not delimited, they weren't drawn onto a map that was then presented to Europeans. Europeans came in and superimposed their own boundaries. And so, in taking a look at this map, does it appear that the Europeans took into account language and ethnicity and tribal boundaries in Africa? And the answer is no, they didn't. All right. Now, I have kind of a funny story. I may have already told it in some of the classes, but I want to include it because it's kind of a good one. My very second year of teaching AP Human Geography, superimposed boundaries was on the AP exam. It was one of the FRQ questions, and I had not prepared my students well for that definition. It was not one that we even mentioned. It was not words that came out of my mouth during the course of that year. So my students came back, and rightfully so were upset that they felt left down. They felt that I hadn't prepared them. I felt that I hadn't prepared them. It was bad. And so I had one of my students who I felt very confident going in the AP exam. He was going to do very, very well. Raised his hand and said, after we were going over this, we waited our 48 hours and we were talking about the FRQs. He raised his hand and he said, on this question, I talked about cake. And I was like, oh no, this is bad. This is very bad. And so after I got his results in July, he had gotten a 5 on the AP exam. Highest score you can get. So the next year, I flagged him down. I was like, dude, what did you say about cake? Because you were supposed to be talking about superimposed boundaries. You were supposed to be talking about how Europeans came in and didn't take into account that Africans had already had their own ethnic and linguistic and political boundaries. And they didn't take that into account. Why did you talk? What did you say about cake? And he said, well, I imagine that I have a birthday cake. And it's my birthday cake. And I've already decided in my head, I know how I'm going to cut up my birthday cake. I want to do triangles. And I had already planned out in my head how I'm going to cut it up. But then my mom brings in my cake, and she cut it up into squares. She didn't take into account the boundaries that I had already laid out in my head. And I was like, that's deep. That's deep. Now, just to be clear, as a general rule on the AP exam, don't write about cake. Just as a general rule, I wouldn't do that. But in this case, that's a great example of explaining it to grandma. Telling it to grandma. Grandma gets what superimposed boundaries are when you explain it like that. So make sure you just describe it in a way that someone would be able to understand it. Generally without talking about cake. All right, physical boundaries. Political boundaries defined and delimited and occasionally demarcated by a prominent physical feature in the natural landscape, such as a river or the crest ridges of a mountain ridge, also known as a natural boundary. So physical, natural, we're talking about some kind of natural feature, natural landscape. So a lot of different examples that we could use. Deserts could be a physical boundary and serve as a great physical boundary generally between regions because they're difficult to get across, and again, boundaries are about control, and so deserts make it more difficult for people to control. So the Sahara Desert is a good example of a boundary between northern Africa and sub-Saharan Africa. In fact, the title sub-Saharan Africa means below the Sahara. So it serves as a boundary, in this case of macrocultural regions, but still. As far as mountains go, we could use the Andes between Argentina and Chile. We could use the Himalayas between East Asia and South Asia. So there are examples there as well. When it comes to water, we can have a lot of different ones. Rivers like the Rio Grande between the United States and Mexico, at least partially between the United States and Mexico. Lake Victoria, there are boundaries drawn through Lake Victoria in Africa between Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda. But also, couldn't an ocean be a boundary? Like, for example, the Atlantic Ocean between Europe and the Americas, between Africa and the Americas. So these are boundaries that are naturally occurring. And so we're going to take a look at the way that you govern naturally occurring boundaries. By talking about the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, the UNCLOS, and it is one of our vocabulary terms, so let's go ahead and define it. It is a code of maritime law, maritime meaning by sea. So we're talking a code of sea law, or law of the water. Approved by the United Nations in 1982 that authorizes, among other provisions, territorial waters extending 12 nautical miles from shore and 200 nautical mile wide exclusive economic zones. Those are two very, very big categories that you are going to want to make sure that you know. Territorial waters and exclusive economic zones. I'm going to tell you guys right now, when we get to economic development, we're going to talk about special economic zones. So you have to be careful when remembering these. The EEZ, the exclusive economic zone, is related to the UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. And this was the product of a supranational organization and was approved by the United Nations, though, to be clear, individual countries have to approve it as well. And, for example, the United States has not. So let's take a look at the details behind the UNCLOS. There were 3 different versions, the third version being adopted in 1982 that actually went into effect in 1994. The third convention began in 1973, lasted 9 years, and 160 different countries participated. And after the 60th country ratified the UNCLOS, it went into effect in 1994. It basically set limits on the amount of ocean a country may claim, and by setting different categories that existed. So here they are, each of which are basically definitions on our vocabulary list. There was 12 nautical miles of territorial water. And a territorial water, or territorial waters, are the area of sea around a country's coast recognized as being under the country's jurisdiction, set at 12 nautical miles in 1982. Again, this is part of the country, so you're subject to the laws of the country and things like that. So, a lot of times if you ever see, it's usually in bad police shows where, some bad guy is racing away from the United States on a boat and they're like, let's get to international waters. They're trying to get out of territorial waters, is essentially what they're saying. They're trying to get out of the waters that are under the jurisdiction of U.S. law. All right. Again, that's set by the UNCLOS in 1982. 12 nautical miles. It also set 200 nautical miles of exclusive economic zone known as the EEZ, a sea zone over which a state has special rights over the exploration and use of marine resources stretching 200 nautical miles from the coast. And the EEZ was really big, and it helped everyone in establishing their exclusive economic zone, but it especially helped microstates because it ensured them 200 nautical miles of sea that they would exclusively have control over, at least economic control over, in which to cultivate resources and fish and things like that. Because a lot of times a microstate, a state that's significantly smaller, might get overshadowed by larger, more populous, more economically developed countries that are surrounding it, and this ensured that that wouldn't happen. And then finally, you have the high seas, the open waters of an ocean or sea beyond the limits of the territorial jurisdiction of a country. Now, there is another term that we're going to add into this here shortly. On this particular graphic, note that there is an additional region that is part of this, an additional zone. We've got the territorial waters, which we mentioned, 12 nautical miles. And it gives some of the provisions that are part of this. So this is going to go into a little bit more detail than I did on the previous slides. And then there is the contiguous zone, up to 24 nautical miles. And again, you see there that it's going to include things like customs, immigration, and the right of hot pursuit out of its territorial waters. So again, using that ridiculous example from, bad police shows, the police would actually be able to pursue them up to 24 nautical miles. Beyond that, I don't know what it would entail. I'm sure there's laws that provide for, how that goes. But I've seen this played out in bad police dramas more than once, unfortunately. The exclusive economic zone, again, up to 200 nautical miles. And then finally, high seas beyond the EEZ. So make sure that you know the order of this, because I could definitely see that being a multiple choice question where they have, different, the different order of this as part of the UNCLOS. Might be kind of ticky-tacky as far as a question, but never can be too prepared. And again, a little visual here to help us with this. So again, we've got territorial sea, the contiguous zone, exclusive economic zone, and the continental shelf they mentioned previously, and then you have got the high seas beyond that. But notice here that it has something as part of the continental shelf that is important, because it says that there's a portion that is potentially claimable, because as part of the continental shelf, they can exploit, quote, non-living resources. So I ask you, what non-living resources do you think they might be referring to? Think. What living resources, what non-living resources, and in particular, what non-living resources is part of the continental shelf. So, brainstorm a little bit. Come up with maybe an answer for that. Because here's what we're looking at. Here's a real life example of this. This is from an article from The Economist called "The Arctic is Now a Frozen Conflict." And it talks about the UNCLOS and how this has essentially created competition for the Arctic. And amongst different groups, Canada, Russia, Norway, Greenland as a colony of Denmark. So a lot of different groups competing. And why are they competing for the Arctic? Because there's no actual land there. But it talks about in the article that the Arctic has perhaps 1/8 of the Earth's untapped oil and about 1/4 of its untapped gas. That's pretty significant. And from an economic development standpoint, that could definitely help a country. So it's something to be considered. Last little bit that we have to get to, we talked about physical boundaries, natural boundaries. Now we have to look at cultural boundaries. So a couple different categories of this. We've got geometric boundaries, political boundaries defined and delimited and occasionally demarcated as a straight line or an arc. It's also known as an artificial boundary. And we see a lot of geometric boundaries in the west of the United States, particularly boundaries that have used lines of latitude and longitude. In fact, the 49th parallel is used as a boundary for a portion of the United States and Canada, which we're going to show here in just a minute. In addition to that, North Africa uses a lot of geometric boundaries, so a couple different examples from a few world regions. On the ethnic side, another type of cultural boundary, ethnic boundaries use either religion or language as dividing points. Great examples for religion in South Asia, India and Pakistan, as well as Bangladesh, were divided up largely based on religion. Boundaries in Eastern Europe and throughout Europe, really, used language. So let's take a look at a couple examples. Again, we mentioned the geometric boundary of the 49th parallel here with the border between Canada and the United States, but also take a look at some of those state boundaries out west. You can see a lot more straight lines and things like that. Not all of them, but a little bit more are used out west. And so we see a lot more geometric boundaries there. In South Asia, we can see this. All right, India, predominantly Hindu. Pakistan, Bangladesh, predominantly Muslim. And when we take a look at boundaries in Europe, they're largely along linguistic lines. Though, to be clear, a lot of nation states as well. So group of people shared cultural background who get their own political entity, and language is a part of that. And after the World Wars, we saw a lot more boundaries drawn in accordance with languages and the division of language to ensure that groups of people were able to govern themselves. So a little bit of that legacy there as well. Last piece that we're going to look at for tonight, last type of boundary, is a relic boundary, a former boundary line that is still discernible and marked by some cultural landscape feature, such as a fence. So some historical or contemporary examples. The Great Wall of China is probably one of the most recognizable one. Abandoned castles between Wales and England that would discern between those two regions. The Berlin Wall, obviously, between East and West Berlin. Still some boundaries that exist between North and South Vietnam from the legacy of the post-Vietnam War era before the communists took control of the entire country. These are all former boundary lines that don't necessarily exist anymore, but are still discernible on the cultural landscape feature, or as a cultural landscape feature. So we leave you with that tonight. Next lecture, we're going to look at the impact of these boundaries. So I'll see you then.